Hello, friends. So we did this yesterday, and I felt it was quite fun and productive. So let's do it again today. We are going to take a look at this page that you see on screen, which is victicara.com/tropical. And the link to it is in the text describing the video below. But we'll look at it together. Yesterday we looked at the first three points on the table of contents. We looked at Surya Siddhanta, the definition of zodiac according to Surya Siddhanta. We looked at the definition of the zodiac from Bhagavad Purana. We looked at the explanation or definition of the zodiac per Brihat Parashara or Shastra. And then we went through this bit, the don't believe the newbie foreigners argument. So if this interests you greatly, then all you have to do is go to this page, victicara.com/tropical, and or just watch yesterday's live stream to see the explanation of this. So today, what I'm going to do today is share the history of the zodiac with you, which is the presentation that I gave at the United Astrology Conference in Chicago in 2018. So guess what? You just get a free ticket to my presentation at the what was it called? Unified Astrology Conference, which was a great conference. So let's do that. Now here on this page, I have kind of a synopsis of what's in here. So let's just read that first. You see, on this page, if you click this first thing over here under where it says notes, then you'll get a PDF. You'll download a PDF of the notes from that presentation. And what I'll do is I'll use that PDF. Will be on screen for you. We'll go through it together soon. And then if you click the video, you don't get to see my presentation at the UAC, but at the UAC hotel room. I think I did this the night before the presentation. Then on this page itself, I wrote up a new summary of it. So let's just read through that first. The summary is that the 12 signs of the zodiac is an eternal concept. In other words, it's not something that began or was discovered by one particular person or one particular culture. It's a ubiquitous concept throughout human culture and civilization for as long as we have records of human culture and civilization. As soon as you have a living being watching the world, trying to figure out when to do what, they easily recognize the cycle of roughly 12 full moons within one solar circuit. So why is this concept of a 12-fold zodiac so ubiquitous, so eternal, so coexistent with human culture? Because it's so simple. Because as soon as you have somebody who's sentient and cognizant, who's trying to figure out the schedule of things that are going on around them, they'll notice that the sun and the moon make certain patterns. You know, the sun rises, the sun sets, basic things like that, and the moon gets bigger and smaller, and the days get longer and shorter, basic things like that. That's all that you need to know to be able to come up with a 12-fold division of the zodiac, of the sky, of the year. And that's why the 12-fold division of the zodiac really is not the invention of any particular culture, but it's just a human way of looking at time. The ability to use those 12 fundamental, the ability to use those 12 zones of the sun's path, however, as part of a sky map, did evolve at a certain point in time. It did not come until human mathematics and observational tools evolved sufficiently, which is about 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, as far as we have scientifically acceptable records of. To help the maths evolve. So do you understand what I'm saying? What I'm saying is that every culture has a concept that the sun's path around the earth, observational path around the earth, which means the tempo of the year, which means the tempo of the sun, the tempo of the sky. Every culture has a concept of that having 12 beats in it. because of the fact that there's 12 lunar cycles within one of those solar cycles. That is not something that anybody invented or discovered. But the ability to use this very rigorously and to position planets which are invisible, during the day, when you see the sun and with the sun's beat, the ability to position planets in reference to this and to use it as part of a map that did develop along with the development of human mathematics and observational tools. And the development of where it became usable is roughly 3,000 or 2,000 years ago. And when that happened, this is now the second paragraph, to help the maths evolve, the pioneers of using the zodiac correlated the 12 signs to various observable stars. And I'll explain that more fully when we get into the actual presentation. Because this would allow them to visually fact-check what their calculations proposed. The calculations proposing that the moon should be at the second beat of the sky. It should be at the beginning of Taurus. Let's check and see if it is. How do you know if it is? Well, there should be a certain star that's there that is a certain amount of degrees away from where it should be, or is exactly where it should be. So let's check and see if the moon is near the star. This is how they developed the math, and this is how they checked the math and perfected the math, by checking it visually. In Sanskrit, it's called a Siddhanta, and you would have to use Siddhanta to adjust the bijam of your calculations. So to help the maths evolve, the pioneers of the zodiac started correlating the 12 signs to various observable stars. This is why you got Libra stars, Aries stars, stuff like that. Soon enough, people like Hipparchus, who was famous for being the first to make a statement about it, which we have a record of, noticed that the correlation between the marker stars and the zodiac markers wasn't truly constant. That the stellar markers slowly drifted from the zodiac points they were supposed to mark. To keep track of this drift, people came up with what we call ayanamsha. It's called ayanamsha in Indian astrology, and this literally means the distance or the measure from a star to the solstice. Ayana means solstice, and amsha means the piece of the pie. How much of a portion is it to get from your reference star to the zodiac reference, which is the ayana, or the solstice? So you see what happened? The concept of 12 zodiacs, it's ubiquitous. It's part of the way humans look at the world. But the ability to use them in mapping the sky rigorously, as you would do with the birth chart, developed about 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. In developing it, they had to correlate those 12 segments of the zodiac to visible things, so they could fact check their calculations. The visible things are the stars. But they also came to notice that the correlation between the stars and the zodiac isn't permanent. It drifts, it changes over time due to precession of equinoxes. So they came up with the concept of ayanamsha to measure how much the marker star is drifting from the zodiac marker. So far so good, right? Most people agreed to keep the zodiac anchored to the solstice and the equinoxes in which it was originally conceived and based, and use the ayanamsha as a variable to keep the stellar cross-checking accurate. But India didn't. And in the presentation, we'll try to figure out why. At least we'll ask the question why. India wanted to anchor the zodiac to their anchor stars because of their indigenous system of lunar constellations, the nakshatras, and thus they created what we call today sidereal zodiac signs. This is an Indian invention. It's not a Babylonian invention, and I'll cover that also in the presentation. Over the centuries, various important people like Varahamihira, S.B. Dikshita, N.C. Lahiri have questioned this and hoped for a reform, as we covered yesterday. So if that interests you and you don't know about it already, then go back and watch yesterday's live stream. Who are these people? Who are these indigenous Indians in the 18th century, 19th century, 14th century, 6th century, who are questioning the movement in India to make the zodiac sidereal? Who were they? Well, some of them were Varahamihira, S.B. Dikshita, and N.C. Lahiri. The reason why the question is because it directly subverts the fundamental definition of what the 12 zodiac signs were in the first place, which is quite important to the Vedanga Jyotish, which is entirely based on solstices and equinoxes. Finally, in the 21st century, we seem to be making some headway on that. Okay, so that's the intro. We'll jump now into the actual presentation itself. Good morning, everybody. So here's the presentation. I'll switch the screen over to this. And here you can see these are the slides that I used to present in 2018 at the United Astrology Conference in Chicago, which is the last conference I went to before we had coronavirus. So Sidereal, the title of the presentation is Sidereal and Tropical Systems in Vedic Astrology. So the first question that we need to ask is, what's the root of all astrology? Because remember, the first principle that I'm proposing is that the 12-fold zodiac concept is not something that some culture discovered or invented. It's a basic, natural, simple way of looking at the world, because it's obvious that there's a year, and it's obvious that there's 12 lunar cycles in the year. So astrology is the interpretation of the heavens, and what are the two most obvious objects up in the heavens? What do you think? What's the two most obvious things that are in the sky? The two most dominant, important things in the sky. The hint is, there's a picture of them on the screen right now. The sun and the moon. So obviously, the origins, the fundamental, the real true foundation of everybody's astrology is going to be the sun and the moon, because that's what is up there in the sky. And the sun and the moon are therefore the fundamental background for how we interpret the sky. Astrology is the interpretation of the sky, the heavens. The sun and the moon are the most obvious things in the sky. And so the sun and the moon form the most important fundamental background for how we interpret the sky. In fact, the sun and moon are so important that the original Vedic astrology described in Vedanga Jyotish of Rig Veda basically does not talk about anything else except the sun and the moon. Occasionally throws in Jupiter. So you could develop an entire astrological system simply on the sun and the moon, and that's what the Vedanga Jyotish actually did. Now, the interesting thing is, what I'm going to explain now is, the sun and the moon are the seeds or the foundation for these two systems, tropical and sidereal. The sun and the moon are the two most visible, important things in the sky, and they form the basis for how we're going to interpret the sky, and therefore they form the basis of these two ways of looking at the sky, one tropical and one sidereal. Let me explain that now. The seeds of the sidereal and tropical systems are found in the fact that the sun and the moon are the two most dominant features in the sky. To interpret the sky, you need to measure how the sky is changing. This is what makes the sky interesting and interpretable, is that it's not always the same. That it changes, and it doesn't change arbitrarily. It changes with a pattern to it. And hence, if you understand the patterns of change in the sky, you understand the tempo, the movement, and the intentions of time itself. So the key thing that human beings start to try to do to understand the sky is to try to understand the tempos and the patterns of the sun and the moon. To observe the sun and to observe the moon, however, is quite different. Can you guess why? What's different between observing the sun and observing the moon? If you observe the sun, when do you do it? You don't observe the sun at night, right? You observe the sun during the day. And if you observe the moon, when do you do it? That's right, Space Bug. You do a moon observation when it's dark out. And you do sun observation when it's light out. And hence we get these two different ways of describing the patterns of the heavens. One night-oriented and one day-oriented. Tropical being day-oriented, sidereal being night-oriented. When you look at the moon and you want to see what pattern it's making, you look at it in reference to nighttime objects, in other words, stars. The word sidereus means stars or stellar. When you say sidereal, you mean stellar. That's what the word literally means. So the moon's patterns are intrinsically going to be discerned or perceived in reference to stars, or aka sidereally. Understanding the moon's pattern gives us a sidereal picture of the heavens. But the sun's movement, the sun's pattern is not observed in reference to stars. When the sun is out, you don't see stars. What do you see? You see daylight. And so the way that we observe the sun's pattern is by the ebb and flow of the light, the amount of light that there is. How long is a day? How short is a day? That's what's changing. So by observing the sun, the way that we understand the pattern of the heavens is by a change in the duration, the relation of the sun to us, the change in the duration of how much time we're being exposed to the sun. And we're noticing that it goes through these certain waypoints, these certain markers. That's what tropos means. A tropos means a marker. No, the clouds don't have anything to do with it. Because whether there's clouds or not, you're still going to see daylight or nighttime. So the four markers are tropos. Trop means to turn, right? Where you have a waypoint where you turn. There's 4 points where the sun's course turns or is notable to have a change. The 2 biggest ones are the ayanas, the solstices, the 2 most important things in Vedanga Jyotish. The north ayana and the south ayana, the upper solstice and lower solstice, where the days and the nights actually start to change their direction. Instead of the day becoming shorter, now it's becoming longer. Instead of the night becoming longer, now it's becoming shorter. That happens at ayanas. And then the other 2 key waypoints or observational, milestones are when the days and nights are equal. Those are equinoxes. And so the sun's movement reveals to us these 4 tropos, or these key waypoints, which are 2 solstices and 2 equinoxes. You see? So this is what I'm saying. These 2 systems are universal and built into the human mind. They're not the invention of some culture at some point in history. It's just by looking at the moon, you create a stellar map of the sky. And by looking at the sun, you create a solar map of the sky, which is based on how much light there is day and night. So the attempt to map the patterns of the sky by looking at the sun generates the tropical system. And the attempt to map the patterns of the sky by looking at the moon generates the sidereal system. And do you understand why the days and nights change? It's because the sun observationally wanders like a pendulum north and south over the equator. Putting it into 3 dimensions and talking about it in terms of 3-dimensional modern astronomy, it's because the Earth is tilted at a 23-degree inclination to the sun, and as it goes around the sun, that causes an observer on Earth to feel that the sun is moving north or south. Okay. Now the thing is, this explanation has been on my page since 2012, so you guys are hearing this for the first time. You're not availing yourself of the information that's out there. But I'm happy to refresh it. All right, seeds of the tropical zodiac. So you got that, right? Both systems have always coexisted. So far, so good? Both systems have always coexisted, but not as contradictory versions of the same thing. So now might be thinking, wait, all of a sudden Vic sounds really conciliatory. He's sounding like he's saying the sidereal way of saying things is reasonable, and the tropical way of seeing things is reasonable. Wait, Vic sounds reasonable all of a sudden. I thought he was supposed to be a fundamentalist Bible thumper who says only the tropical is correct. No, actually, since 2012, I've been saying that sidereal is one way of looking at things, and tropical is another way of looking at things. But the tropical way of looking at things gives you a pattern of 12 divisions. And the sidereal way of looking at things gives you a different pattern. I'll explain what it is. They're not two different versions of the same thing. Hence, there's not a question of which is more accurate than the other. Love wins. They're both to be used together, but do not think that I'm telling you that sidereal zodiac was created by the moon. The moon creates a different picture. Does not have 12 divisions in the sidereal system. The solar system, the tropical system has 12 divisions because the course of the sun going up and down like this is punctuated by 12 of the moons going like this. Conversely, the moon going around the earth like this gets punctuated by 27 of the suns going like this. I'll explain that in a second on the next slide. So when people say, hey, sidereal and tropical are just two ways of looking at the same thing, that's absolutely correct. But the sidereal way of looking at it is not Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer. It's something else that you may not be aware of because it's fallen out of favor. When you talk about Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, you're talking about the first division from the equinox, the second division from the equinox, the third division from the equinox, the first division from the solstice, etc. This is how tropical and sidereal are really to be married. Not by having them both try to identify the same thing as being in two separate places, but by having them identify two different natural patterns which are in the sky. So please just rewind 1 minute and hear what I just said, and that'll answer your question. So here, let me now explain how these divisions are created. Okay? Here you see a clock, basically, because the clock is based on this same natural thing. They patterned a clock based on the zodiac when they invented the clock. So we can use it very easily to explain why the zodiac is what it is. If you take a clock and you just make the shorthand, the hour hand, represent the sun, and the long hand, the minute hand, represent the moon, that's exactly in perfect ratio to the actual movement speeds of the sun and moon. So what you'll see is in the course of the hour hand going around the clock once, the minute hand will go around 12 times. That's exactly the idealized speed relationship between the sun and the moon. So I'll give you an animation of that. You intersect the sun's equinoctial movement by the moon cycles. That's what I was talking about before. The sun is going north and south of the equator. Meanwhile, the moon is coming by. Full moon, full moon, full moon. So here's what it looks like actually. The sun is moving at that rate and the moon is moving at this rate. Every time the moon gets back to the top, make a marker on the sun's path. Make another marker. Make another marker. Another. How many you got? 12 markers. What are they? There you go. That's what it is. That's what the 12 zodiac divisions are. That is what they are. That's why there's 12 of them. Not 13, not 27, not 18, not 36. That's why there's 12 of them. This is why they're not stars. They have nothing to do with stars. They have everything to do with the sun's intersection by the moon. Now, these are called rashi. Do you know why they're called rashi? Rash comes from Rajana, which means light, sunlight. Rashi means a bit of sunlight. So the light of the sun ebbing and flowing over the year gets divided into these 12 things called rashis. Of course, other people will give other explanations of why it's called rashis. But this is one very important explanation. If you want to know how the lunar fields are calculated, I don't have an animation for it, but it's very simple. To know how the lunar fields are calculated, the sidereal fields, just flip it around. Put the sun symbol on the moon hand and put the moon symbol on the hour hand. And basically it's the same thing. So in other words, take the moon's orbit around the earth as one cycle. And then take the sun's rising and setting as another cycle, the minute hand that moves faster. It will move 27 times faster. Idealized 27 times. 27 and change faster. Also, this is idealized. It's 12 and change faster. The nakshatra fields are what they are because the nakshatra fields are the moon's orbit being punctuated by the sun's pattern of rising and setting. The rashi fields, the zodiac fields, are what they are because they're the sun's orbit being punctuated by the moon's tempo of orbiting the earth. Do you understand? Teresa, listen to the video that I linked today, which is part 3 of the video I posted 4 years ago. The constellation of Virgo is 45 degrees wide. The sign, this proves the whole argument. Oh, look at it with an actual telescope and you'll see that the actual constellations are the actual signs. They're actually not. This is what the zodiac signs are. This is why they're all 30 degrees. You guys also, you got to, if you really want to grasp this, then you need to learn it carefully. Because you're just picking bits and pieces here and there and not understanding what people are saying. So that's how you do the solar and lunar fields. And you get these things called nakshatra, which are stars. Stars are called nakshatras because they don't move. So just to review what we said so far, these ways of looking at the sky coexist. A way of looking... The astrology itself is an attempt to interpret the sky. The two biggest things in the sky are the sun and the moon. Hence, the sun and the moon form the basis of how we interpret the sky. When we look at the moon, we do it at night. And so we measure it in reference to stars. And when we measure the moon's 27 fields, we anchor those fields to the stars. That field is in reference to that star. See that red star over there? That is Rohini. And the field that's near it, that's Rohini's field. That area of space. But that other one next to it, that's all shiny and sparkly with a bunch of them, that's Kritika. That's the next field. Because that's what you see when you look at the moon, you see stars. So the nature of trying to make sense of the sky by looking at the moon's patterns leads us to anchor things to stars. The nature of looking at the sky and making sense of the sky by looking at the sun's pattern makes us anchor things to the sun's intensity, the ebb and flow of the day and night, which we measure by these 4 key waypoints, the solstices and equinoxes. And we punctuate one by the other, because the sun and the moon are the 2 key players. You punctuate the moon's pattern by the sun, and you punctuate the sun's pattern by the moon. God, you guys... So what is the difference between a rashi and a nakshatra? The nakshatras are the stars, and the rashis are divisions of the sun's path. Hopefully some of you are understanding this. So this way of doing the 27 constellations is the Indian way. There were other cultures have had other ways of doing it. I'm just going to hide this. Other cultures have other ways of doing it. So for example, The Babylonians have 18. Now, people are going to try to tell you that the 12 zodiacs came from Babylon because they had one that they called the scales. The Babylonian system has 18 divisions. It is not the 12-fold system. It's a sidereal system of 18 constellations. And the Babylonians also had, just like every other culture in the world, the Babylonians also had a 12 equal division system based on the equinoxes and solstices. And I'll go over that with you tomorrow when we look at the Mullah pin. Egyptians had constellations also. They had 36. I don't really know, because I don't specialize in Babylonian and Egyptian things. I don't know why they came up with these numbers, but I can tell you why the Indians came up with 27. And that's what I just did. So now let's talk about history. So far I've explained the origin of the two systems. They originate in trying to make sense of the patterns of the sky, one via the sun and one by the moon. Now let's talk about the history of how they've been used. The actual truth is that the sidereal system was initially much more prevalent, almost entirely prevalent, more prevalent than the tropical system. Because to use it, you could just use your eyes. So when you go back more than 3,000 years ago, and you look at notes about what were astrologers doing in those times, they will constantly only talk about things which they saw in the sky. They saw this happen near this star, and then this happened on Earth. And they make records of it like that. So very, very old astrology was observational because they did not have the tools developed, the observational tools or the theoretical tools, the math, to be able to do anything other than what they could actually see. So the first records of astrology being used are all observational astrology, and hence stellar. Or when they're using the tropical system, as in the Vedanga Jyotish, they're talking about the equinoxes and solstices and how they relate to nakshatras, how they relate to stars. That's what is in the Vedanga Jyotish. As history progresses, astronomy progresses, and mathematics progress. And astrology evolves from being something based on observation to being based on calculation. What's the difference between observation and calculation is, calculation, I can calculate what I would observe if I could see something. But I don't have to actually see it. So for example, when it's midnight, I can calculate that the sun is basically beneath my feet, underground, by math and knowing astronomy. I don't have to actually see the sun beneath my feet, but I know that it's there. And so as calculations evolve more and more, we can calculate where Venus is, we can calculate where Mercury is, we can calculate where the rest of the planets are. Even the moon, which moves so quickly, we can calculate where the ascendant is by knowing the sun's relationship to how soon it's going to rise. So as human society develops its sciences more and more, astrology moves from being something which we only do at night to something that we do all the time. And we use more than using our eyes, we're starting to use pencils, calculate things. When we develop this when we develop this skill or ability to use calculation so prominently, then we enable ourselves to use the tropical system. Because why? What is the tropical system? It's a measure of sunlight. You don't see planets when you're looking at the sun. You see blue sky or clouds or something. So in order to put planets in reference to the sun, you're going to have to do some degree of calculation because they're not always going to be in the nighttime sky. So it's not until human society developed the ability to calculate the position of planets, that they could use the tropical zodiac for things like we use them today. This is why initially, very long time ago, the tropical zodiac wasn't used for any kind of fortune telling or prognostication or predictions. But when you look at history, about 2,500 years ago, there was an immense explosion of the use of the zodiac. All of a sudden, it became the rage. It became like Cardi B, like so popular. And everybody was just into it and started using it, and it hasn't worn off ever since. Now, what happened initially, as humans transition into being able to do the calculations that are required to be able to use the tropical divisions, they don't just all of a sudden become perfect at it. They gradually develop the skill. So since the early calculations were a work in progress, they need to have observational correction. And in fact, even to be able to develop the first versions and hypotheses about what the mathematical theories and formulas should be, you have to rely on observation. I think Saturn should be near that star tonight, and that star is in this relationship to the equinox, so that star is that zodiac degree. Let's see if it's actually true. It wasn't true. This math must have been wrong. Let me work on my math more. Even though it's hard to do it with Saturn because Saturn moves so slow, but you'll do it with the moon. They would really practice it with the moon. So they kept on saying, we think the moon should be at 24 degrees Taurus today, and that would put it near this star. So let's look. We got it. That's right. All right, so now we're starting to do it right. So they had this habit and this system of correlating the invisible zodiac to visible things. Because the only way to check if your theory is correct is to check something visible. If you understand that, then you understand why there's a Scorpio constellation, there's a Libra constellation, there's a Virgo constellation. Because they corresponded marker stars, and they made approximations of the zodiac to visible things. Not very long time ago, about 2,500 years ago, prior to that, constellations were recorded quite differently. Indians didn't have these 12 constellations. Indians have 27 constellations on the ecliptic. Babylonians didn't have these 12 constellations. They had 18. Egyptians didn't have these 12 constellations. They had 36. It wasn't until we started using the tropical zodiac that we said, let's get 12 on the ecliptic too to match this, so it's easier for us to look up and see the references, because we don't really trust our calculations. We want to fact check them. Is it clear? So in order to observationally correct their calculations, they correlated the tropical signs to sidereal markers, to stellar markers. That's where the confusion happens. Hipparchus is the person that history notes as being the one who said, this is not very reliable, because the stellar markers do not keep a permanent reference to the tropical markers. There's precession of equinoxes. So we will get inaccurate if we keep referring to stars. So we have to have something called ayanamsha, which knows the rate of drift between the equinox point or an ayana point or solstice point and a reference star. Hipparchus is credited with that, although it is in Surya Siddhanta, which is Indian tradition says much older than Hipparchus. But whatever, we don't have to fight about who invented this. Hipparchus should be credited for applying this idea, realizing that this idea is relevant. He was the one who realized that this was relevant and applied it to an actual, the actual situation that's going on. So after this is Before this, there's no such thing as a tropical versus sidereal question. Before Hipparchus. So when people say, are there ancient charts which are tropical, or are there ancient charts with the sidereal? There's no question of that in any of the astrologers or astronomers' minds previous to Hipparchus. And even post-Hipparchus, there's no significant difference. The drift of the precession of equinoxes is extremely slow. So it isn't until several centuries that there is a significant difference between the marker stars and the zodiac constellations. But after Hipparchus makes it a known issue, then the astronomers and astrologers say, all right, we can't keep doing this lazy thing of just measuring. You do one calculation, zodiac to stars, and then you look up at the stars. It's not going to work anymore. Let's get more thorough with our calculations. And it took a few centuries, both in the West and in the East, for this to settle down. You'll find historical records of Vidius Valens and other Western important astrologers sometimes saying that this is a reference star for this zodiac sign, sometimes making sidereal allusions, some other times making tropical allusions, because there's this period of time where people are adjusting to the fact and whether accepting or believing or not believing Hipparchus. But what happened in the West is that everybody eventually comes to grips with it and says, all right, we need to keep the zodiac signs anchored to what they originally are based on, which is the sun's ebb and flow of day and night. So we need to use this thing called ayanamsha to measure how far that has moved. It's how far those marker points are drifting from the stars that we can observe. But India did not. India was the one place in the world that disregarded Hipparchus. So now I'll give you a slide about, why. Why did India disregard Hipparchus and embrace the sidereal zodiac? What you notice with the other cultures, the other astrologically active cultures like Babylon, Egypt, Greece, they erased their previous sidereal traditions and replaced them with the tropical system. But not the Indians. The Indians don't like to erase things. They don't like to change things. They kept their 27 nakshatras. And they also, as I said, every human society has these 12-fold divisions. The Vedanga Jyotish talks about the divisions based on the solstices and equinoxes. It's ancient in India. But now that we're using them the way we're using them in a modern context with planets and everything, the rest of the world said, all right, we're going to forget about our old way of doing things. The Indians said, we're not going to forget about our old way of doing things, but we're going to marry them together. We're going to marry this old system that we are used to observing planets, doing observational astrology in these nakshatra fields. How close is it to a star? We're going to marry that to this new calculation system of tropical zodiac. And so they say, look, Ashwini is the beginning of Aries. Where Ashwini nakshatra starts, that's where Aries starts. As you can see pictured here on the screen. Because that's the way it was 2,000 years ago. Roughly. And that's just the way it's going to be from now on. That's what they say. Because, why? That's the next question that I have up on the screen. Why? Why did they differ from the rest of the world? Where the rest of the world acknowledged Hipparchus and said, okay, stars are different than the zodiac signs. So we have to keep we have to keep reckoning the ayanamsha, the distance between the stars and the signs. Whereas India said, nah, we're going to make the zodiac signs part and parcel of the stars. Why? Nobody really knows. Even Varahamihira, the great Varahamihira, who's like India's Vidyas Valens, or better, expresses confusion about what's going on. If you want to find out more about that, you look in Pancha Siddhantika. These references are on screen right now, and Brihat Samhita. But to give you the short version of what he says there, he says the solstices mark the beginning of Capricorn and Cancer, because this is what's said in the ancient texts, that the solstices mark the beginning of Capricorn and Cancer. Yet the solstices move through the stars. They drifted through the stars. And this is also said in the ancient texts, like Vedanga Jyotish. But the people around me are acting as if the solstices don't drift through the stars, and they're giving the beginning of Capricorn and Cancer to the nakshatras instead of the zodiacs, just because that's the way it was yesterday. That's what Varahamihira said. And he didn't really give anything more conclusive about it. He just observed this weird thing that was going on. I have my opinion about why. It's that it's very beautiful or compelling. The way the 27 stars coincide with the 12 and the 108 mathematically. It will, for example, accentuate the Gandanta, which is an important concept in astrology. The Gandanta, the borders of things, the borders of things are very important, and there's a big border every elemental segment. You get elemental segments of fire, earth, air, and water, and then it repeats. So you have 3/3 in the zodiac. And the borders between those thirds are more significant than the rest of the 12 borders. The nakshatras, if you line Aries up with Ashvini, then the nakshatras also accentuate those Gandantas. You see how they end right on the Gandanta. Aslesha ends at the end of Cancer. And even more so than that, the way that they tie in with the 108 navamshas is you get exactly 4 navamshas per nakshatra. Only if you say Ashvini does not waver from the beginning of Aries. If you let it waver, then sometimes it's going to be always that same size, but not neatly exactly within one nakshatra. And so they developed concept of nakshatra padas, which is a novel invention of 2,000 years ago. It's not in the Vedanga Jyotish. It's not in indigenous Indian way of looking at nakshatras to divide them into padas. It's only after the importance of the Sidereal Zodiac came about that they started to care about this thing called padas and develop things based on padas and start to explain things based on padas and predict things based on padas. So my personal opinion is that this synchronicity that there was between their 27 constellations and these zodiacal divisions was too compelling. They didn't, like the rest of the world, give up their previous system. They hang on to it because they have a good conservative nature, and hence that conservative nature also tends to make them not want to change things. So they don't want to change the beginning point of Aries either. Nobody really knows why India did not go with the rest of the world, but this is my opinion. Now you say, well, cool, then let India do what it wants to do right there. But the problem is that it needs to be reformed. Because the problem is that the definitions of the Rashi and the Nakshatra are not in harmony at all with the system. The Nakshatra are defined as the moon's reference to the stars. The moon's the husband of the Nakshatras. The sun is the husband of the Rashis. The definitions of these things don't support zodiacal science. Now, at this point, let me just review some of these definitions with you, because I don't want you to just believe people. You should ask for their references. So here's the references. Surya Siddhanta, Bhagavad Purana, Brihat Parashara, Hor Shastra. So Surya Siddhanta, Bhachakra Nabhau Vishivat Dvityam Samasutragam. Ayana Dvitiyam Chaiva Chatusta Pratitastuta. The two solstices and the two equinoxes are the thread upon which the core of the zodiac exists. It's saying the sky is a wheel, Bhachakra, and the hub of the wheel is found where the line between the solstices and equinoxes cross. You got a wheel, you got a hub. Where's the hub? If you have two solstices and two equinoxes, draw a line, Samasutraga. Draw a line between each one, the part where they meet, that's the hub of the zodiac. The thing which causes the zodiac to turn, the thing which defines what the zodiac is the diameters drawn between the solstices and equinoxes. It's tropical. Tad atreshu sankranti dvitiyam puna. There's two borders in between each one of these cross, right? So you get 12. It takes the sun 6 months to reach the northern solstice after entering Capricorn. So the southern solstice is synonymous with Capricorn's entry, Sankranti. And 6 months to reach the southern solstice after Karka Sankranti, after it enters the top. These 12 divisions beginning from Aries are certainly the months which constitute the year. There's no difference between the months of the year and the signs of the zodiac, according to the Indian text. The classical Indian text, before this whole issue of Hipparchus and zodiacs and calculating nativities, birth charts, before any of that, the zodiac was defined in this way. Now they change it so that it's defined in the beginning of Aries. It's defined in the beginning of Ashwini. Bhagavad Purana says the same thing. The sun moves at varying speeds between the northern solstice, southern solstice, and equinox points. I think what is really meaning here is the length of the day is not always the same. Its rise to the northern solstice, its fall to the southern solstice, and its crossing the middle point can be known by observing the time, the amount of time that it takes for the sun to have a day. The days and nights grow longer and shorter, revealing which of the signs, Capricorn, etc., the sun is in. When the sun is in Aries and Libra, the days and nights are equal. When the sun is in the 5 signs starting from Taurus, the days grow longer and the nights grow shorter month by month. When the sun is in the 5 signs starting from Scorpio, the day and nights change in the opposite way. That's the Puranas are explaining that. The Puranas are very, very old Indian culture. Brihat Parashara Hora Shastra. Listen, scholar, I will explain the positions of the stars and planets. Akashe yani drishanti jyotirbimba anekshaka. In the sky, there's lots of dots of light. Teshu nakshatra sangyani graha sangyani kahichit. Some of them are called nakshatras, others are called grahas. Some are stars, some are planets. Which one? Not rashis. Rashis are not mentioned. Rashis are not jyotibimbas. Which ones? Tani nakshatra namani sthirastanani yanivai. The ones that are called nakshatras are the ones that don't kshana. The ones that nakshana are nakshatra. The ones that don't change. The ones that stay in relationship, fixed, anchored together. They form constellations. Those are nakshatras. Gachantu bhani grillanti satatam tute graha. But the other ones that move as if they had volition or grilla, those are called graha. Planets. The Bhat chakras nagashvamsa ashvinyadi samadhiva. The celestial wheel has integral portions called Ashvini and so on. It's like a wheel being turned by a horse. That wheel of Jyotibimbas is divided into Ashvini. The stars are divided into Ashvini. Ashvini, Kritika, so forth. But that same space can also be divided into 12, which would be known as Aries, and so on. Tad dvadasha vibhagas tu tulya meshadi sangyaka. But means it's different. That those sky can be divided by the stars into 27 things, but there's another way to look at it, which is based on Tulya and Mesha, which is based on equinoxes, Libra and Aries. And that divides the sky into 12. The division of the sky into 12 is different from the division of the sky into 27. So all of these classical Indian definitions, there aren't any other ones, by the way, which compete, which define things in a different way. All of these classical Indian definitions don't define the zodiac in a way that lets you say that the beginning of Aries is eternally the beginning of Ashvini. That's the problem. Even though, wow, it looks nice and it's really cool, and 4 of them fit inside one nakshatra, and 9 of them fit inside one Gandanta. What is it, 9? Yeah, right? Whatever it is, you get 9 nakshatra fit inside one Gandanta. Yeah, that's really cool and it's nice. But so what? That's no reason to divorce and give up what the actual essence of the way you defined the thing in the first place. So that's the problem. It's problematic that the definitions of the nakshatra and the rashi from the core Sanskrit texts do not support sidereal zodiac signs. So, for example, even the Vedanga Jyotish, Vedic astrologers in and out of India, which I went over yesterday, Dikshit, Lahiri, Krishna Swami, so many people have long sought to reform India's zodiac, but it is only recently gaining slight traction. The reform system uses tropical signs and sidereal nakshatra side by side. This is what I was saying early in the presentation. Sidereal is one way of looking at the sky. Tropical is another way of looking at the sky. They coexist side by side, and are both valid ways of looking at the sky. But the sidereal way of looking at the sky does not tell you where Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer are. The sidereal way of looking at the sky tells you where constellations are. And those constellations are Ashvini, Bharani, Kritika, and so forth. The tropical way of looking at the sky tells you where Aries, Taurus, Gemini, and so forth are, and does not tell you where Ashvini, Kritika, Bharani are. To know one from the other, you need a translator. If you can see the stars and you want to know where the zodiac is, or if you know what the zodiac coordinate is and you want to see it in terms of the stars, you need a translator. And that translator is called ayanamsha. What the ayanamsha is a measure of, literally it's actually a measure of solstice, not equinox, but any one of the 4 points, any one of the 2 types, equinox or solstice, will work. It's a measure from the ayana, or a tropical point, to a star or a sidereal point. That's what the ayanamsha is. The mind-blowing thing is that Indian astrologers say you should apply the ayanamsha to the tropical thing. The ayanamsha is the measure of how far the tropical thing is from the sidereal thing. You use ayanamsha to translate from one pattern, the moon's sidereal pattern, to the other pattern, the sun's tropical pattern, or vice versa. Because it shows you how far it is to a reference. So, for example, this is a simple ayanamsha, which is Revati Paksha. Ayanamsha, it takes Zeta Pisceum, which is the Yogacara for Revati. It's the prominent star in Revati. And it tells you it's got this much arc from the equinox, which is the closer by tropos. And the rate of change is X over X years. That's the translator. And hence, with this equinox ayanamsha thing, the reformed Vedic wheel currently looks like this. Uttara Bhadrapada, about the third segment, the end of the third segment of Uttara Bhadrapada, is currently at 0 degrees Aries. And it's gradually moving in that direction. This is why 5,000 years ago, when the Vedas were last edited, Kritika is put in the place of Ashvini. Because if you rewind time, that middle wheel of the white stars rewinds that way, and you'll get Kritika come over to where the equinox is. So if you come back, reincarnate in like 400 years or something, Purva Bhadrapada will be at 0 Aries. And in this way, the progress of history can be measured by the equinox moving through the nakshatras. But the important point that I hope that you can get is that the tropical and sidereal ways of looking at the sky are two co-eternal, natural human ways of looking at the sky. The mistake is to forget the actual constellations of the tropical sky and to replace those actual constellations with the 12 zodiac signs. So that was interesting. And questions that let's see, I've been ignoring questions and answers so I didn't get distracted. I see. No, I don't want to turn off. See, Sam says, hey, Vrudge, can you please turn off the slow comment setting? No way. You're lucky that I leave the comments on at all. You see how annoyed I get by the comments sometimes? How did Rome mess up the calendar? They didn't. They just added months in. The Christians actually changed the calendar by messing around with Easter, which is why you have the months. The zodiac's ingresses are on the 21st instead of firsts. Bardo asked, nakshatras are part of the Vedas, but Rashi are not? No. That's the first thing that I said in the whole lecture, Bardoji. That I said this so many times in the lecture. What are you listening to, Bardo? That the 12-fold way of looking at the sky and the sidereal and tropical ways of looking at the sky are eternal, natural ways that human beings from all cultures have looked at the sky. India has the 12-fold solstice-based way as the foundation of Vedanga Jyotish in the Rig Veda. But previous to 3,000 years ago, not much was done with the tropical system because it requires a lot of exacting calculations to be able to use it. Hopefully that sinks in. You got to watch these videos many times. Maybe because I've spent so much time with these ideas, I expect you guys to be able to grasp them as fast as I can present them. But I think you need to, the amount of time that I'm not giving a live session, you should just be watching my videos so that you can catch up and it sinks in. Oh my God. What else do we got? Any other questions? Bhavana, welcome. Bhavana, this whole thing came out because of you. Spacebugs mentioned something which I want to address. The relevance of the human experience being unearthed and the light of the sun being literally core versus the severity of the effects of distant stars on human life. No. Stop thinking like that. You are not a plaything. You are the divine being, and your actions are central. You're not being controlled by gods and stars, and it doesn't matter how much influence the star has. Astrology is not meant like that. The first thing that I wrote on the presentation was that astrology is an attempt to interpret the stars. The earliest astrologers described astrology as sky language. Later on, after this guy Ptolemy, people start to think like you're thinking. Because Ptolemy has to contend with hard science in Greece and physics and people wanting direct material observable causes to their effects. So what Ptolemy tried to do is he tried to say astrology is not unreasonable because look how much the sunlight affects you. Look how much the moon affects us. And so the stars even are sending some sort of a wave through the atmosphere, which gets amplified depending on what time of the year it is, which affects human beings. This is all bunk. This is just Ptolemy trying to apologize to rationalists of his era. That's not how astrology works. Astrology is just a clock. It's a clock in the sky that just tells you what is going on. It doesn't create what's going on. The clock doesn't create the time. The clock doesn't create and end your life. You live your life. You cause it to begin and end. You cause the affairs in your life. But the clock will tell you what's going on and what's on schedule, the calendar, etc. The positions of the planets in the sky is a very, very, very fancy, sophisticated, detailed clock. So don't think about what the stars influence me. The sun influences me. They don't influence you. This is not astrology. Astrology is what we infer symbolically by reading the language of the sky. So it doesn't matter if a star is far away or closer than the sun. Abhishek, the only question left to be answered is how are they getting good enough results using a bad enough technique? So Abhishek, the next time I do a live stream, you see this table of contents. Original video transcription from 2012. Next time I'll go over this with you guys. If you don't want to wait till next time, go to victorcara.com/tropical. Click onto this and read this. This section right here, which one is correct. This will explain why. You can get pretty good results using a good system, and you can get pretty bad results. You can get pretty good results using a kind of not so great system, and you can get pretty bad results using a perfect system. The veracity of the system should not be judged based on the results of the interpretation, although 190 million% of you guys out there think that it should. You all want to see which system better explains Hitler, or which system better explains Einstein or Tesla. This is all very, very, very gray area of interpretation, and there's a lot of factors that are involved besides just the zodiac coordinates. The actual fact of the matter is that the real determination of the veracity of the system should be done based on intelligent understanding of the system, which is what I tried to share with you. Bhavana says, the concept is simple enough to get. The mental block for me comes because I'm used to linking the flavor of each nakshatra with sidereal rashis. This is the problem. When you're used to everybody telling you, Magga, the reason why Magga is so like Magga is because it's at the beginning of Leo. And look at the navamshas which are within Magga. Nobody ever realized that Vedic people didn't give a rat's ass about Leo. They didn't even know where Leo was. They didn't care. That's not true. But really, when they're talking about, they did not talk about Leo, Vedic people. That is true. They talk about Magga as Magga and Pitri Griha. It's the house of the Pitris. The reason why Magga is because it belongs to the Pitris, who are the Vedic gods that are associated with that star. They live in that star. That's what gives that star its symbolic meaning. Later on, modern astrologers trying to explain what the nakshatras are, who have no idea what the Pitris are, or don't care anymore, they start to say, well, it's because it's in Leo. So that's why I wrote the book. I don't know how many years ago it was, 27 Stars, 27 Gods. To show that you don't need anything except knowledge of the gods to be able to understand the nakshatras. Then I realized that there's this thing in the Taittiriya Brahmana called Nakshatra Sutra, and so I translated that and published that also. And that's called Nakshatra Heart of Vedic Astrology. With just those two things, you understand what the nakshatras are. No reference to zodiac signs. Guys, I have to admit, I like this. I like the ability to communicate about this. And although this information is old, this is stuff that's from 2012, 2018. It needs to be refreshed and rediscussed. So I'm happy to be doing this. And I think I'll just continue doing it. Every time I get some free time, I'll just pop a microphone in front of my face and go to whatever point in this page we are at. So that'll be it for today. Thank you so much for joining me.